The Hells Angels biker found the little girl holding a tarnished dog tag near a faded flag, and the truth behind it broke him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into today's story. On a cold, cloudy afternoon in the middle of nowhere, Jake Reaper Morrison, a Hells Angels biker, cruised down the empty highway on his Harley-Davidson, the sound of the engine roaring in the silence of the vast landscape. He had been riding for hours, his mind lost in the rhythm of the road, when suddenly, a faint cry reached his ears. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, this time more distinct and filled with desperation. Slowing down, Jake's eyes scanned the area. There, just off the side of the road, he saw her, a small, ragged figure standing beside an old, faded American flag. She was clutching something in her hands, and as Jake approached, he noticed it was a tarnished dog tag. His heart sank. He stopped his bike, the tires grinding against the gravel, and dismounted, his boots thudding against the earth as he walked toward the little girl. She was thin, barely able to hold herself upright, with dirt smeared across her face. Her eyes were wide, filled with fear, yet there was a strange calmness in the way she held the dog tag, like it was something sacred. "Hey kid," Jake called gently, his voice softer than he intended. "What are you doing out here all alone?" The little girl flinched at the sound of his voice, her grip tightening around the dog tag. Jake took a step closer, his heart aching for the child who seemed so small against the backdrop of the open road. "Are you lost? Are you hurt?" he asked, his rough exterior giving way to a hint of concern. She didn't speak at first, just stared at him with those big, innocent eyes, and for a moment, Jake wasn't sure if she would answer. Finally, she whispered, my daddy left me here." Her voice was barely audible, but the weight of her words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. He had seen things in his life, things that would haunt most people forever, but this was different. The little girl's pain was raw, and it stirred something deep inside him. As he looked at the tarnished dog tag in her hands, something about it seemed oddly familiar, but he couldn't quite place it. "What's your name, kid?" Jake asked, his tone softening. The girl hesitated, then whispered, "Emily. Emily Wilson." Jake's heart skipped a beat. The name sounded familiar, but it took him a moment to realize why. Wilson. He had known a Wilson once, a man who had served with him in the military, someone he had lost contact with years ago. But that wasn't the only thing that made the name hit him hard. It was the dog tag. The one the little girl was holding was eerily similar to the one his old friend had worn before he died in combat. Jake knelt down, carefully taking the dog tag from her trembling hands. "This belonged to your dad, didn't it?" he asked, his voice catching in his throat. Emily nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. "He was a soldier," she whispered, "and he promised he'd come back for me. But he never did." The air seemed to grow heavier with the weight of her words, and Jake felt a pang of guilt. His old friend had never come back from the war, and now, his daughter was left alone with nothing but a faded memory and a tarnished dog tag. Jake stood up, his heart aching for Emily. "Don't worry, kid. I'm not going anywhere," he said softly, his voice firm with a promise he didn't know if he could keep. But in that moment, he knew he couldn't just leave her there. He had to help. Little did Jake know, this would be the beginning of a journey that would change both their lives forever. As Jake stood there holding Emily's father's dog tag, the weight of the situation began to sink in. He had seen many things in his life, but this was different. The little girl in front of him was now his responsibility. He couldn't just walk away, not after what she had said about her father. He looked down at the dog tag, his fingers gently tracing the worn metal. It felt like the ghost of his past was staring back at him, a painful reminder of the price he had paid for the things he had done. "Emily," Jake said, his voice a little strained as he held the dog tag in his hand. "Where did you say your father went?" Emily's small voice trembled as she replied, "He went away to war. He said he would come back, but he never did." Jake's heart ached. He remembered his own time in the service, the comrades he had lost, and the promises that had been broken. He couldn't help but feel a connection to the little girl in front of him. "I promise you," Jake said, trying to sound reassuring. "I'm not going anywhere. I'll make sure you're safe." The words felt hollow as he said them, but he meant them. He couldn't turn his back on her. He had to keep her safe, no matter the cost. Jake knelt down to Emily's level and wiped away a tear that had fallen down her cheek. "Where's your mom?" he asked softly, looking around. But the area was empty, the road silent except for the wind. Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with fear. "She's gone," she said, her voice breaking. "She left when Dad didn't come back. I don't know where she went." The realization hit Jake like a ton of bricks. Emily was alone. Her mother was gone, and her father, the man who should have been her protector, was dead. All that was left was the dog tag and a faded flag. Jake's hand tightened around the tag as he stood up. He had no idea what to do next, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't leave her out here alone. "Come on, kid," Jake said, his voice gentler now. "Let's get you somewhere safe." He gently took Emily's hand and led her to his bike. The sky above them had darkened, the storm that had been threatening earlier now beginning to show its face. The wind picked up, and Jake could feel the temperature dropping as he helped Emily onto the back of the Harley. "Hold on tight," he said, making sure she was secure. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but Jake wasn't about to leave her out in the cold. As he started the engine and revved it, the sound filled the air, almost as if it were announcing their departure. Emily clutched him tightly as they rode off into the storm. The cold wind whipped through Jake's hair, but he wasn't paying attention to the weather anymore. His mind was on Emily. What had happened to her mother? Where had she gone? And what would he do now? As they rode through the empty streets, Jake's mind raced with questions he didn't have answers to. He had been a loner for most of his life, but something about Emily had changed that. He had made a promise to her father, even though he hadn't known him well, that he would keep her safe. But how could he do that when he didn't even know where to take her? The first place that came to mind was his old garage. It was the only place that had ever felt like home, even if it was a little run down. The place where he had spent countless hours working on bikes and fixing up old cars. It wasn't much, but it was safe. As they pulled into the gravel driveway, Jake glanced over at Emily, who had fallen quiet, her head resting against his back. He could feel her warmth even through his leather jacket, and it reminded him of the fragility of life. Emily had been through so much already, and Jake knew that the road ahead wasn't going to be any easier. He had no idea how to be the kind of protector she needed, but he was going to try. "This is it," Jake said softly as he helped Emily off the bike. He took her inside the garage, the familiar smell of oil and metal filling the air. It was a small place, with just enough room for him and a few bikes. The floor was covered in grease stains, and the walls were lined with tools and old motorcycle parts. But it was his sanctuary, the one place in the world where he could focus and forget about everything else. Jake set Emily down on the old couch in the corner of the room and went to get some blankets from the back. As he returned, he saw her staring at the dog tag in her hands again. She had been so quiet since they left the road, lost in thought. "You're safe now," Jake said as he gently covered her with the blankets. "I'm going to take care of you, Emily. You're not alone anymore." But even as he said the words, he knew that this was just the beginning. The truth behind the dog tag, the mystery of Emily's father, and the secrets that seemed to linger in the air were all things he would have to face. And he didn't know if he was ready for any of it. The next few days felt like a blur. Jake spent most of his time trying to make sense of everything. Emily had barely spoken since that first night at the garage. She kept to herself, sitting in the corner of the small room, clutching her father's dog tag like it was the only connection she had left to the world she once knew. Jake couldn't blame her. He had seen the kind of pain that turned people into shadows of themselves. But he couldn't help but feel the weight of her silence pressing down on him. He had promised her father that he would protect her, but Jake wasn't sure how to keep that promise when he didn't even understand what had happened to the girl's mother, let alone how to provide the safety she needed. That evening, as the sun began to set and the garage dimmed, Jake decided it was time to figure out what happened. He had to learn more about Emily's family. He couldn't let her live in this limbo, and he sure as hell couldn't let her grow up in the dark. Jake stood up from his chair, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. He crossed over to where Emily was sitting, staring down at the dog tag. Her eyes were glassy, distant, lost in a memory he couldn't reach. "Emily," Jake said softly, kneeling down in front of her. "We need to talk." She didn't look up at him right away, but she slowly shifted her gaze from the dog tag to his face. "About what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "About your father, about your mother," Jake said. He didn't want to push her too hard, but he needed to know what had happened to her. "Where's your mom? Why did she leave?" Emily's shoulders tensed at the mention of her mother. For a long moment, she didn't speak, her lips pressed tightly together. Then, finally, she said, She didn't leave. She just disappeared." Jake's heart sank. The mystery deepened. "What do you mean, disappeared?" he asked gently, sitting next to her. Emily hugged her knees to her chest, her small hands trembling. "One day she was there, and the next, she was gone," she explained. "I don't remember much. It was all so fast. I woke up, and she wasn't in the house. I looked everywhere. I thought she'd gone to the store, but she never came back." Jake sat in silence, trying to process her words. Something didn't add up. He had seen a lot in his life, but this felt different. A child shouldn't be left alone like that. And Emily was too young to be left with such a heavy burden. Jake stood up and walked over to the workbench, grabbing his jacket. "I'm going to find out what happened," he said. "I promise you, Emily. You're not alone in this." Emily didn't respond, but Jake could see the faintest glimmer of hope in her eyes. She was trusting him, and he couldn't let her down. As Jake stepped outside, the cool evening air hit him like a slap in the face. He had to get answers, and he knew where to start. There was one person who might know something, someone who had been part of his past, the man who had served alongside Emily's father. Jake's old friend, a soldier, a man he had fought beside in the worst of times. The man had disappeared after the war, and Jake hadn't heard from him since. But now, everything pointed back to him. If anyone knew the truth about Emily's family, it would be him. Jake mounted his Harley, his mind set on the road ahead. As the engine roared to life, he glanced over at the garage. Emily was inside, and he wasn't going to let her down. He couldn't. The ride to the old neighborhood was long, but it gave Jake time to think. The streets were familiar, but the memories that came with them weren't always good. He had left this life behind for a reason, but now, it was pulling him back. Emily's father had been a good man, a soldier who had fought for something greater than himself. But what had happened to him? And what was Emily's mother's role in all of this? As Jake approached the address, a cold feeling settled in his chest. The house looked abandoned, the front yard overgrown with weeds. The windows were dark, the door slightly ajar, as though no one had been there in years. He pulled his bike up to the curb and dismounted. His heart raced, and his instincts told him to be careful. But he had to go in. He couldn't walk away now. Jake pushed open the door, the hinges creaking in protest. The inside was just as he expected, dusty, forgotten, and empty. But then he saw it. A photo on the wall, framed and yellowed with age. It was of Emily's father, standing with a group of men. His old friend was in the picture, standing next to him, smiling like they had all the time in the world. Jake walked over to the photo and traced the faces with his fingers. He knew them all. Men who had fought beside him, men who had bled with him. But where were they now? What had happened to them? A noise behind him made him turn, and that's when he saw it. A door at the far end of the room, half hidden behind old furniture. He knew he had to go through it. This was where the answers were. He walked toward the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to find, but he knew it was time to uncover the truth. Jake slowly pushed open the door to the dimly lit room, his heart racing as the old wood creaked in protest. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but the air was thick with the scent of dust and abandonment. His boots echoed softly against the floor as he stepped inside, the faint glow from the broken windows casting long shadows across the room. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, like the entire house was holding its breath, waiting for him to uncover the truth. The door that had caught his attention earlier was barely cracked open, and Jake's instincts told him to be cautious. He moved toward it, slowly and deliberately, his hand resting on the handle as he hesitated for just a moment. What was he about to discover? He had to know, for Emily's sake, and for his own peace of mind. With a steadying breath, Jake pushed the door fully open. The room beyond was small, filled with old furniture and stacks of papers. A faded map of the world hung on the wall, its edges curling with age. In the center of the room was an old wooden desk, cluttered with papers, files, and photographs. Something about the desk felt important, like it held the key to the answers he had been searching for. Jake stepped inside, his eyes scanning the desk. He carefully moved aside a pile of yellowed papers and reached for a small, weathered envelope tucked away in the corner. As he opened it, a piece of paper slipped out, one that was marked with a name he recognized immediately, Wilson. It was a letter, dated from several years ago. The handwriting was neat but hurried, the ink slightly smudged as if it had been written in a rush. Jake unfolded it carefully, his eyes scanning the words. "I'm sorry, my friend. I have to go. They know who I am, and they're coming for me. If anything happens, you have to take care of my family. Promise me you'll look after them. The truth must never come out. It's the only way to keep her safe." Jake's breath caught in his throat as he read the last part. Keep her safe. The letter was from Emily's father. The message was clear. He had known something dangerous, something that could put Emily in harm's way if it ever got out. Jake felt a chill run down his spine as he reread the letter. The they in the letter could only mean one thing. Someone had been after Emily's father, and now, Emily might be in danger too. He folded the letter back up and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He knew what he had to do next. Jake turned back toward the desk, his eyes scanning the rest of the room for anything else that might provide more answers. He picked up a few more photographs, most of them showing soldiers from different eras, but none with Emily's father or anyone Jake recognized. But then, in the back corner, he found a small, locked box. His heart skipped a beat. This was it, the thing that could reveal the full truth. Jake reached for the box, his fingers trembling slightly as he examined it. It was old, worn, and locked tight. He ran his hand over the surface, feeling the engravings along the edges. This was no ordinary box. It was important. It had to be. Jake's mind raced as he searched his pockets for anything that could open it. He pulled out a small metal tool he used for fixing bikes, praying it would work. With a few swift movements, he managed to pry open the box, the lock giving way with a satisfying click. Inside, he found a bundle of documents, maps, and another dog tag. This one was different. It wasn't tarnished, like the one Emily had been holding. This one was pristine, almost new. Jake's fingers trembled as he picked it up, his heart pounding. The dog tag had a name engraved on it, a name he had never seen before. He carefully spread out the papers, his eyes scanning the contents. The documents were all marked with the same symbol, an emblem Jake recognized from his time in the service. This wasn't just any group. It was a covert military operation, one that had long since been disbanded. The papers detailed covert missions, secret assignments, and most troubling of all, a list of individuals connected to it. Emily's father had been involved in something far bigger than Jake had ever imagined. And now, somehow, Emily was caught in the middle of it. His mind raced as he pieced together the puzzle. Emily's father had left these documents for a reason. He had known the danger was coming. But what had happened to him? Had he been killed because of what he knew? And who was after Emily now? The thought of Emily being dragged into this world of secrets and danger made Jake's stomach turn. He couldn't let that happen. Not on his watch. He quickly gathered the documents and the dog tag, shoving them into his jacket. He knew that he needed to get back to Emily, but the question remained. Where could he go from here? What was he supposed to do with all of this information? As Jake stood in the abandoned house, the weight of his responsibility pressed down on him. The room felt colder now, the silence deafening. He could feel the storm outside growing stronger, but his mind was focused on one thing. Keeping Emily safe. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing for certain. He couldn't back down now. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of raindrops hitting the roof of the garage. The storm outside had grown more intense overnight, with the wind howling against the small building, making it feel as though the world outside was crashing in on them. He sat up on the worn couch, glancing over at Emily, who was still asleep, curled up under the blanket he had given her. Her face, though peaceful in sleep, still carried the burden of fear and uncertainty. Jake had no idea what the future held for her, or for him, but he knew one thing. He couldn't leave her to face it alone. The documents from the box in the abandoned house weighed heavily in his jacket pocket, the dog tag a constant reminder of the promise he had made to Emily's father. He hadn't fully processed everything yet, but the pieces were beginning to fit together. Whoever had been after Emily's father, whoever had caused all this pain, wasn't done. They would be coming for her next, and Jake wasn't about to let that happen. He stood up quietly, making his way over to the small kitchen area to brew some coffee. The familiar smell of the dark roast helped clear his mind, and as he waited for it to brew, his thoughts raced. He needed to make a plan, but where to start? The letter he had found in the old house had made one thing clear. There were people out there who knew about Emily's father and what he had been involved in. The truth, whatever it was, had to be buried at all costs. But who were these people? And what did they want with Emily? Jake had to get answers. As he sipped his coffee, Emily stirred on the couch, her eyes slowly opening. She blinked, confused for a moment, before looking up at him. Jake gave her a small smile, trying to reassure her, though he could see the uncertainty in her eyes. "Morning, kid," Jake said softly. Emily yawned, sitting up and rubbing her eyes. "Is it safe here?" she asked, her voice still hoarse from sleep. Jake paused, the weight of her question hitting him hard. He had told her she was safe, but the truth was he wasn't sure anymore. "For now," he said, trying to keep his tone steady. "But we need to be careful. There are people looking for you, Emily. People who would hurt you to keep their secrets hidden." Emily's eyes widened, fear flashing across her face. "What do they want with me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jake knelt down beside her, looking her in the eye. "I don't know yet, but I promise you, I'm not going to let them hurt you." Emily nodded slowly, clutching the dog tag in her hand once more. Jake stood up, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He had to figure out where to go next, how to protect Emily. The garage wasn't safe forever. The storm outside had only intensified, and the city was still far away. Jake knew he couldn't stay hidden here forever, but he didn't have a clear plan. He turned to Emily. "I need to make a phone call," Jake said. "I'll be back in a minute." He stepped outside, into the downpour, feeling the rain soak through his jacket as he walked toward his bike. He had a few people he could trust, but not many. He needed someone who could help him, someone who could get them out of this mess before it was too late. Jake pulled out his phone and dialed the number, waiting as it rang. On the other end, the voice answered with a deep, gravelly tone. "Jake, it's me," Jake said. "I need your help. There's a kid. Her father was involved in something I don't fully understand. But I need to protect her. I need to get her out of here." There was a pause on the line before the voice responded. "I don't know what you've gotten yourself into, but you're not alone. I'll help you. Where are you?" Jake gave him the location of the garage, and after a few more words, the call ended. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't know who he could trust, but this guy had been through the same kind of trouble before, and that was enough for now. Jake returned to the garage, where Emily was still sitting on the couch, staring out the window at the pouring rain. "We're going to be okay," Jake said as he sat beside her. Emily turned to him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but she didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She trusted him, and that was enough for now. The sound of the rain outside continued, the storm growing stronger, but Jake knew they couldn't stay hidden here forever. They had to move, and they had to do it quickly. Jake didn't know how long they had before whoever was after Emily would find them, but he wasn't going to let that happen. Not if he had anything to say about it. He had made a promise, and he was going to keep it, no matter the cost. The rain had finally started to slow, but the storm's aftermath lingered in the air as Jake sat at the small table inside the garage. He glanced over at Emily, who was now sitting by the window, looking out at the wet streets, her hands wrapped tightly around the dog tag. Her face was pale, her expression distant. Jake knew she was scared, but there was something more in her eyes. Something that reminded him of himself, an unspoken burden that weighed heavy on the heart. He couldn't help but feel for her. It wasn't just the promise he had made to her father that kept him going. It was the need to protect her from a world that had already taken too much. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was the call he had been waiting for. He quickly pulled it out, pressing it to his ear. "Jake?" the gravelly voice on the other end said. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in 20. Jake's grip tightened on the phone. This was it. This was the chance to get Emily out of the line of fire, to get her somewhere safe. He glanced over at her again, but this time, her eyes met his. She knew something was happening, something was changing. "We're leaving soon," Jake said softly, walking over to her. "You ready?" Emily nodded, though her face was a mix of fear and uncertainty. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, barely audible. Jake's heart clenched. He wished he had an answer, something concrete, something that would reassure her. But the truth was, he didn't know where they were going next. I'm going to make sure you're safe, Jake replied, trying to sound confident. That's all that matters right now. Emily looked down at the dog tag in her hand and then back at Jake. Do you think we'll be safe? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. Jake knelt down in front of her, placing a hand gently on her shoulder. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, Emily. I promise. But even as the words left his mouth, Jake wasn't sure he believed them himself. He couldn't control what was coming. Whoever had been after Emily's father, whoever had left these breadcrumbs of danger for her to follow, they weren't going to stop. Not until they had what they wanted. He couldn't let them take Emily, not when she had already lost so much. Just then, a knock on the door broke the silence. Jake's instincts kicked in, and he was on his feet in an instant, reaching for the gun tucked inside his jacket. Stay back, Jake ordered, his voice low. Emily looked up at him, fear in her eyes, but she stayed silent. Jake moved cautiously to the door, peeking through the small window. It was his contact, the one who had agreed to help. He hesitated for just a moment before opening the door. The man standing outside was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore a dark jacket with a patch that Jake recognized. He had been part of the same network, a trusted ally from the old days. You Jake? The man asked, his voice deep and steady. Yeah. Jake replied, his hand still on the door. You got the goods? The man nodded and reached into his bag, pulling out a small black duffel. Everything you need. You're not safe here, though? We need to move fast. Jake stepped aside, letting the man in. You brought a ride? He asked, glancing back at Emily, who was now standing in the corner, watching the exchange carefully. I got it covered, the man said, his eyes briefly flicking to Emily. You trust this guy? Jake asked, his tone skeptical. The man met his gaze. I've got no reason not to. Jake nodded. He knew there wasn't much time. Whoever was after them was likely closing in. He had to get Emily out of here, fast. Let's go, then, Jake said, turning to Emily. We're leaving. The man walked over to Emily, giving her a nod of reassurance. Don't worry, kid. We've got you. Emily, hesitant at first, looked to Jake for confirmation. He gave her a small nod, though his mind was already racing with plans and contingencies. He couldn't afford to make a mistake. He couldn't let anything happen to her. They stepped out of the garage and into the wet, cold night. The air felt thick with tension, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Jake led Emily to the back of a large, black van parked nearby. It was unmarked, nondescript, the kind of vehicle that wouldn't attract attention. The man had already opened the side door, and Jake motioned for Emily to climb in first. She hesitated, looking up at him. It's going to be okay, Jake said softly. We're going to get through this. Emily nodded, her face pale but determined. She climbed into the van, followed by Jake, who closed the door behind them. The man got in the front, starting the engine. The van rumbled to life, and they drove off, the sound of tires against wet pavement filling the silence. As they drove through the darkened streets, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The city seemed to stretch on endlessly, the lights from passing cars illuminating the night like fleeting glimpses of a world they were trying to escape. Jake looked at Emily, sitting quietly beside him. She was clutching the dog tag tightly, her fingers wrapped around it like a lifeline. We're going to get you somewhere safe, Jake said, more to himself than to her. The road ahead was uncertain, but there was one thing he knew for sure. He wasn't going to stop until Emily was safe, no matter the cost. The van hummed quietly as it sped down the highway, the wipers moving rhythmically across the windshield as the rain continued to fall. Jake sat in the back with Emily, who was huddled in the corner, clutching the dog tag with both hands. She hadn't said much since they left the garage, but Jake could see the fear in her eyes, even though she tried to hide it. It was the same fear he'd seen in his own reflection countless times, the fear of the unknown, the fear of something he couldn't control. He leaned back against the seat, his mind racing. The documents, the dog tag, the letter from Emily's father, they all pointed to something big, something dangerous, and whatever it was closing in on them. He had no answers yet, only questions, and no one to turn to but the man driving the van, who was his only contact right now. They had to stay on the move, but Jake didn't know where they could go. They couldn't hide forever. He had promised Emily's father that he would protect her, but the weight of that promise was becoming more than he could bear. The man driving the van glanced in the rearview mirror, meeting Jake's eyes. "We're getting close," he said, his voice low and steady. "There's a place where you'll be safe, but it's not far from here. You'll need to stay low." Jake nodded, his grip tightening on the seat. Safe. The word felt like a lie. No one was safe, not with the people chasing them. But they had no choice but to trust this man, at least for now. "We'll be fine," Jake said, even though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We just need a plan." Emily shifted beside him, looking up at him with her wide, uncertain eyes. "Do you think we'll be okay?" she asked, her voice small. Jake didn't know how to answer that. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. He wasn't just protecting himself anymore. He had someone else's life in his hands, and he didn't know if he could keep her safe. He turned to face her, trying to offer a reassuring smile, though it felt like it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm going to make sure you're okay," he said, his voice firm. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Emily nodded, but the uncertainty in her eyes remained. She had every reason to be scared. Jake reached into his jacket and pulled out the dog tag, his fingers tracing the worn metal. It felt heavier now, like it was pulling him into a past he couldn't escape. The letter, the symbol, the connections, it all pointed to something much bigger than a simple soldier's death. He didn't know what it was, but he was going to find out. They had to. Jake felt a pit form in his stomach. The weight of the situation was becoming too much to bear, but there was no turning back now. He couldn't let Emily go through this alone. "I'll keep you safe," Jake whispered to himself, his grip tightening around the dog tag. Just then, the man in the front seat made a sharp turn, taking them off the main highway and onto a narrow road lined with trees. The darkness seemed to swallow them as they moved farther from the main road, the only light coming from the headlights. Jake felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Something didn't feel right. The man driving seemed calm, but Jake's instincts told him to be ready for anything. "You sure this place is safe?" Jake asked, his voice low. "As safe as it gets," the man replied. But Jake didn't trust him completely. He knew better than to trust anyone in a situation like this, especially someone who had been involved in the kind of world that had claimed Emily's father. The van slowed as they approached a large, run-down building, a former warehouse that had seen better days. The man parked the van behind it, out of sight from the road. "This is it," he said, getting out of the van. Jake hesitated for a moment, then climbed out after him. He glanced back at Emily, who had followed him silently. He gave her a reassuring look before turning to the man. "We stay here?" Jake asked. The man nodded. "For now, we can get you out of here when it's safe." "Safe?" Jake repeated under his breath. It was becoming a hollow word. Nothing was safe, not with the people who were after them. But there was no choice but to trust the man for now. The warehouse was quiet, its walls covered in layers of grime and rust. The man led them to a back room, which was surprisingly well kept. It was small but functional, with a couple of cots in the corner and shelves filled with supplies. There was a single light hanging from the ceiling, casting a dim glow over the room. Jake could hear the rain outside, the steady patter on the roof, but inside, there was an eerie stillness. "You can stay here for the night," the man said, setting down his bag. "We'll figure out the next step tomorrow." Jake glanced around the room. It wasn't much, but it was a roof over their heads for now. He couldn't afford to be picky. "Thanks," Jake said, his voice tired. The man nodded. "I'll be nearby if you need anything." With that, he left the room, leaving Jake and Emily alone in the silence. Jake sat on one of the cots, his head in his hands. He was exhausted, but the weight of everything pressing down on him made it hard to sleep. Emily sat down beside him, her eyes filled with questions that Jake didn't have answers to. "What now?" she asked, her voice small. Jake looked at her, trying to hide the worry in his own eyes. "Now," he said, "we rest. Tomorrow, we figure out how to finish this." But deep down, he knew it wasn't going to be that simple. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm that was coming for them, and Jake wasn't sure if they could weather it. But he had made a promise to Emily's father, and he wasn't about to break it. The next morning, Jake woke to the sound of rain still tapping against the roof, the heavy storm continuing its relentless assault on the world outside. He sat up on the cot, rubbing his face with his hands. His body was tired, worn down from the constant stress of the past few days. The room was dim, but the pale light of the early morning filtered in through a small crack in the wall. Emily was still asleep on the cot beside him, curled up in the blanket, her dog tag resting on her chest. It was hard to ignore the weight of the promise he had made to protect her. But as the hours ticked by, Jake realized more and more that he was running out of time. He could feel the tension building. The calm was only temporary. Someone, or something, was coming for them. He had seen the signs in the documents he found, the hidden messages in the letter, and the dog tags. He wasn't the only one looking for answers. The knock on the door had come late last night, and the man who had helped them seemed too calm, too collected. Jake didn't trust him completely, but he had no choice. They needed him. They needed someone who could guide them through the mess they had found themselves in. It wasn't just Emily's father they were up against. It was a much bigger game, and Jake was realizing just how deep it went. He stood up and stretched, trying to shake the tension from his muscles. Emily stirred on the cot, and Jake turned to look at her. She opened her eyes slowly, looking around the room, still groggy from sleep. Jake walked over to her, sitting on the edge of the cot. "Hey," he said softly, "you okay?" Emily nodded, though her face was still full of uncertainty. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake didn't know how to answer her. The truth was, he didn't have a plan. He was just trying to survive, to keep them both alive long enough to figure out the next move. "We'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice steady, but inside, he was filled with doubt. "We have to keep moving. We can't stay here forever." Emily didn't respond, but her eyes locked onto his, searching for reassurance, for some sense of safety. Jake gave her a tight smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Listen, kid," Jake continued, "we're going to get through this. I'll make sure of it." Emily nodded again, but the fear in her eyes didn't go away. Jake sighed and stood up, pacing the room. His mind was spinning with thoughts of what had happened to Emily's father, who was behind all of this, and how he could get them out of it alive. He couldn't shake the feeling that the danger was closing in, and the only way out was to keep moving. Just then, the man who had helped them the night before appeared in the doorway. His face was grim, and his eyes quickly scanned the room before settling on Jake. "We need to talk," the man said. Jake walked over to him, feeling a tight knot form in his stomach. The man had been helpful so far, but Jake knew better than to trust anyone completely. "What's going on?" Jake asked, his tone cautious. "The people looking for you," the man said, lowering his voice. "They know you're here. They've been tracking your every move. They won't stop until they find you." Jake's heart sank. He knew they couldn't stay here, but where could they go? "Where do we go now?" Jake asked. The man stepped closer, his voice low. "I have a safe house, about an hour from here. It's the best shot we have, but we have to move quickly." "They're already on their way." Jake nodded, his mind racing. They didn't have time to waste. "Let's go," he said. "We don't have a choice." He turned to Emily, who was now standing by the cot, her eyes wide with fear. "Emily," Jake said gently, "we have to leave. We're going to get out of here, okay?" Emily nodded slowly, though Jake could see the fear still clouding her face. "I'll be right beside you," Jake promised, offering her his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, her small fingers wrapping tightly around his. Together, they walked toward the door. The man was already outside, waiting for them. Jake took a deep breath, bracing himself for whatever was to come. They couldn't afford to stay any longer. They had to keep moving, or they would become sitting ducks. As they stepped out into the cold morning air, the rain had let up, leaving behind a world that seemed even darker than before. The streets were quiet, the world still, as if waiting for something to happen. Jake glanced around, trying to stay alert. He could feel the weight of the dog tag in his pocket, the weight of the promise he had made to Emily's father. He had no idea what was waiting for them, but he wasn't about to let anything happen to Emily, not while he was still breathing. "Stay close," Jake said to Emily as they made their way to the car. He could feel her hand gripping his tightly, her small frame pressed close to his side. He didn't know how long they would have before the people after them showed up, but Jake knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going down without a fight. They all climbed into the car, the engine starting with a low rumble as the man behind the wheel pulled out onto the road. "We're not safe yet," the man warned. "But it's better than here." Jake nodded, his eyes scanning the road ahead. They had no idea what kind of trouble they were about to face, but one thing was clear, they weren't getting out of this unscathed. Not if Jake had anything to say about it. The car sped down the empty highway, the engine growling as it cut through the silence. Jake kept his eyes on the road ahead, but his mind was elsewhere, constantly running through the possibilities of what could go wrong. The man driving, his old contact, kept his focus on the road as well, but there was an edge to his demeanor, a tension that Jake could feel in the air. It was clear they weren't alone in this anymore. The storm had subsided, but the heavy weight of the situation was still hanging over them. Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her eyes darting around nervously, her small hands clenched tightly around the dog tag. Jake's promise to keep her safe weighed heavily on his shoulders, but every passing second felt like they were getting closer to something far more dangerous than he could ever imagine. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but nothing seemed out of place. Yet, the quiet was unsettling. There was always a sense of being watched, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following them. After what felt like an eternity of silence, the man driving broke it. "We're almost there. Just hang tight," he said, his voice low and steady. Jake didn't reply immediately, just nodded and kept his eyes on the road. The man had been useful, but Jake still didn't fully trust him. They were heading to an old safe house, a place Jake knew from his time in the service, but there were no guarantees. Not in a world like this. Not when people like Emily's father were involved. Emily shifted in her seat, her voice breaking the silence. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small, hesitant. Jake glanced back at her, offering a smile that he hoped would reassure her, but he knew it didn't. "We're going somewhere safe," he replied, though he wasn't sure how true that was. They had to keep moving, that much was certain. Staying in one place too long was never an option. Emily didn't look convinced, and Jake couldn't blame her. She had already lost so much. The last few days had been a whirlwind, and now they were heading into the unknown. There were people out there who wanted her, and Jake wasn't sure how long they could outrun them. But he would fight for her, no matter what it took. They arrived at the safe house just as the sun began to set. The house was tucked away in a secluded area, far from the prying eyes of the city. The man parked the car behind the house and killed the engine. "Stay close," he said, glancing at Jake. "I'll check the place out. Don't want to take any chances." Jake nodded, keeping his hand on the door handle as he glanced at Emily. She was quiet, too quiet, her gaze fixed on the window. She was scared. He could see it in the way her shoulders were hunched, the way she gripped the dog tag so tightly. "It's going to be okay," Jake said softly. "I'm right here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with doubt. "I don't know if I can keep doing this," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I don't want to be alone anymore." Jake's heart broke. He couldn't imagine what it was like to be in her shoes, to feel like the world was falling apart around you, and the only thing you had left was a promise made by a stranger. "You're not alone," Jake said, his voice firm, though inside, he was as lost as she was. "You have me, and I'm not going anywhere." Emily didn't say anything else, but the slight nod she gave him was enough. They both knew the danger wasn't over. But they had each other, and that had to be enough. The man returned moments later, nodding to Jake. "All clear," he said. "We're safe for now." Jake stepped out of the car and walked toward the house, Emily following closely behind. The door creaked as the man opened it, revealing a small, modest interior. It wasn't much, but it was a place to rest, a place to plan their next move. Jake led Emily inside, closing the door behind them. The man gestured toward the small living area. "Take a seat. I'll get some supplies," he said before disappearing into another room. Jake sat on the worn couch, his eyes never leaving Emily. She had settled into a chair in the corner, still clutching the dog tag. Jake ran a hand through his hair, trying to push away the feeling of dread that was clawing at him. They were safe for now, but for how long? The people who had been after Emily's father weren't just going to disappear. They would keep searching, keep hunting until they found what they wanted. And Jake couldn't let that happen. He couldn't let Emily become another casualty of a war that had never been hers to fight. He stood up suddenly, his mind made up. "I'm going to find out what's going on," he said, his voice resolute. "I can't keep running forever." Emily looked up at him, her face filled with concern. "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice small. Jake turned to her, forcing a smile. "I'm going to make sure you're safe. I'll find the answers. But I can't do it alone." Emily nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, Jake saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They had a chance. They weren't alone. They had each other. And that was all Jake needed to keep going. The quiet hum of the house was almost deafening as Jake paced back and forth. He was tired, his body ached from the constant stress of the past few days, but he couldn't stop moving. He needed answers, and the only way to get them was to dig deeper. He couldn't protect Emily if he didn't know what they were up against. The man who had helped them the night before had given them a moment of safety, but Jake knew it wouldn't last long. He had to find the people who were after them, and he had to do it before they found Emily. Emily was sitting at the small table in the corner of the room, her fingers still wrapped around the dog tag, her eyes distant. She hadn't said much since they arrived, but Jake could tell she was scared. She had every right to be. She was only a kid, and yet, she was wrapped up in a mess she couldn't even begin to understand. Jake stopped pacing and walked over to her, sitting down beside her. "Hey," he said softly. Emily looked up at him, her eyes tired. "What are we going to do?" she asked. Jake ran a hand through his hair, thinking for a moment. He wanted to tell her everything would be fine, that they would make it out of this, but he couldn't lie to her. "I'm going to find out what's going on," he said finally. "I'll get to the bottom of it. We'll get through this, I promise." Emily nodded, though her expression didn't change. She didn't believe him, not really. She had seen too much, felt too much, to put any real faith in promises. But Jake couldn't give up on her, not when she needed him the most. Just as Jake was about to stand up and leave the room, the man who had helped them the night before returned. He walked in quickly, his face serious. "We've got trouble," he said, his voice low. Jake tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun he had tucked into his waistband. "What kind of trouble?" Jake asked. The man didn't answer right away. He walked over to the window and peered out through the blinds, scanning the street outside. "They're getting closer," he said finally. "I've seen the cars. They're searching for you, and they're not going to stop until they find you." Jake's stomach tightened. He had known this was coming, but hearing it confirmed made it all too real. "What do we do now?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. The man turned to face him. "We need to move. Now. I've got a place we can go, but we can't stay here. They'll find this place soon enough." Jake looked at Emily, who had been silent the entire time. Her wide eyes were locked on him, and Jake could see the fear in her expression. He hated seeing her like this, hated that he couldn't shield her from the world's dangers. But he wasn't going to let her face this alone. "Emily, we need to go," Jake said, his voice gentle but firm. She nodded slowly, standing up from the chair. She still hadn't said much, but Jake could tell she was ready to follow his lead. He was all she had left, and he couldn't afford to fail her. They quickly gathered their things, packing only the essentials. Jake kept his eyes on the man, waiting for him to lead the way. The man motioned for them to follow and walked toward the door. Jake grabbed Emily's hand, and together they followed the man out into the night. The air was damp and cool as they made their way to the car, the faint sound of footsteps behind them making Jake's heart race. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. "Stay close," Jake whispered to Emily as they slid into the back of the car. The man got into the driver's seat, starting the engine. The car pulled away from the house, and Jake looked back one last time, scanning the shadows. The quiet streets gave way to the hum of the city in the distance, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was far from over. As they drove through the city, Jake kept his eyes on the rearview mirror, scanning for any sign that they were being followed. The man didn't say much, keeping his focus on the road, but Jake could feel the tension in the air. They were running out of time, and every second brought them closer to danger. The streets blurred by as they made their way out of the city and toward a new destination. Jake's mind was racing. He had no idea what was waiting for them, but he had to be ready for anything. The man had promised safety, but Jake had learned long ago not to trust promises. "How much further?" Jake asked, breaking the silence. "Not long," the man replied. "We'll be there soon." The night stretched on, and as they continued down the winding road, Jake's thoughts drifted back to the letter he had found, the one that had set all of this into motion. Whoever had been after Emily's father, whoever had made him disappear, was still out there, and they weren't going to stop. Not until they had what they wanted. And Jake knew that what they wanted now was Emily. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her eyes still wide with fear. She didn't understand at all, but Jake did. The people after them weren't just after answers, they were after revenge. And Emily, for reasons Jake still didn't fully understand, was the key to it all. They couldn't stop running, not until they found the truth. But the closer they got, the more Jake realized that the truth might be the most dangerous thing of all. The car sped down the darkened highway, the steady hum of the engine masking the tension building inside Jake. He kept his gaze fixed on the road, but his mind was spinning with thoughts. Every mile they traveled took them further from the city, further from the safety they had temporarily found. Emily sat quietly in the back seat, her small form barely visible in the dim light. The silence between them had become heavy, and Jake could feel the weight of her unspoken fears pressing down on him. He didn't know how to explain everything to her, or even how to protect her anymore. The world they were running from was bigger than he could have imagined. The people after them weren't just out for answers. They were after something darker, something that involved Emily in ways Jake hadn't yet pieced together. He glanced at the rearview mirror, but the road behind them was empty, a vast stretch of nothing. Still, the unease gnawed at him. The feeling of being watched, the sense that danger was closing in, wouldn't go away. They couldn't outrun it forever. Just then, the man driving turned off the main road onto a narrow dirt path. The trees around them grew denser, their branches reaching out like long, skeletal fingers. It was as if the world had closed in on them, the quiet stillness broken only by the sound of the tires crunching over the dirt. Almost there, the man said, his voice low. Jake nodded but didn't speak. His mind was too preoccupied with the uncertainty of their situation. They reached the end of the path, where a small, old house stood hidden among the trees. The place was barely visible, camouflaged by the overgrown shrubbery. It was the kind of place that didn't belong, like a forgotten relic left to decay in the middle of nowhere. The man parked the car behind the house, out of view from the road. "Stay here," he ordered as he got out of the vehicle. Jake stayed put, looking over at Emily. She was staring at the house, her face pale, eyes wide with apprehension. Is this really safe?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake hesitated before answering. "It's the safest place we have right now," he said, trying to reassure her, though he wasn't sure if he believed it himself. The man returned a few moments later, his face tight. "It's secure," he said shortly. "Let's move." Jake helped Emily out of the car, making sure she stayed close to him. As they walked toward the house, Jake's senses were on high alert, his every instinct telling him to stay cautious. They entered the house, and the man led them into a small, dimly lit room. The air inside was thick, musty from years of neglect. The furniture was old, and dust covered every surface. But it was shelter, and for the moment, that was enough. The man closed the door behind them, locking it with a heavy thud. "You two should rest," he said, his tone brisk. "We'll figure out what's next in the morning." Jake nodded, but his mind was still racing. He didn't trust this place, and he didn't trust the man, but he had no choice. Emily had already sat down on the couch, her eyes locked on the dog tag in her hand. Jake sat across from her, watching her closely. She was quiet, lost in her thoughts. He wanted to comfort her, to tell her that everything was going to be okay, but the words felt empty. He didn't know what was going to happen next. He didn't know if they could outrun the danger, or if it would catch up to them no matter where they went. Emily finally looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. "What happens now?" she asked softly. Jake sighed and leaned forward, running a hand through his hair. "We figure out who's after you," he said, "and then we stop them." Emily nodded slowly, but there was a look of uncertainty in her eyes. Jake could tell she didn't believe him, not fully. And who could blame her? She had already been through so much, and now she was thrust into a world she didn't understand, a world of danger, secrets, and betrayal. "Do you think we can stop them?" Emily asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jake looked at her, trying to find the right words. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm not going to let them hurt you. I'll do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Emily looked down at the dog tag again, her small fingers running over the worn metal. She didn't say anything, but the silence between them felt heavier than ever. It was as if the weight of everything that had happened, everything that was about to happen, was pressing down on them both. The man moved around the room, making sure everything was in order, but Jake's mind wasn't on the safe house anymore. It was on Emily's father, on the letter, on the danger that was still out there, lurking just beyond the horizon. Whoever was behind this wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. And that was what terrified Jake. He couldn't let Emily fall into their hands. Not after everything. Not after all the promises he had made. He stood up abruptly, unable to sit still any longer. "I'm going to make a plan," Jake said, his voice firm. "I can't wait around any longer." Emily looked up at him, her expression cautious. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to find out who's behind this," Jake said, his gaze hardening. "And then we're going to end it. Once and for all." Emily said nothing, but the fear in her eyes was enough. Jake knew the road ahead was going to be dangerous, but he wasn't going to let her face it alone. Not while he still had breath in his body. Not while he still had a chance to protect her. The air in the small safe house felt thick with tension as Jake stood by the window, his eyes scanning the surroundings. The silence was unnerving, but the storm inside his head was louder than any storm outside. Emily was sitting on the couch, still clutching the dog tag tightly, her eyes fixed on it as though it held the key to everything. Jake could feel her anxiety, even without her saying a word. She had been through too much already, but it wasn't over yet. Jake had made a promise, to keep her safe, to find out the truth, and to put an end to the danger once and for all. But every step they took felt like they were getting deeper into something much darker than he had ever imagined. He ran his hand through his hair, trying to steady his thoughts. Whoever was behind this, whoever had been pulling the strings, wasn't just a random enemy. They were connected to something bigger, something far-reaching and dangerous. The letter from Emily's father, the hidden documents, and the dog tags were all pieces of the same puzzle. And the more Jake uncovered, the more he realized that the danger wasn't just coming for Emily anymore. It was coming for him, too. The man who had brought them to the safe house had been quiet ever since they arrived. He had a way of moving through the shadows, always a step ahead, always calculating. But Jake wasn't sure if he could trust him. The man had done what Jake needed him to do, get them out of the city, but now they were on their own. The man had made it clear that they couldn't stay here for long. They had to move again, but where to? And who could Jake trust to help them? He couldn't keep running forever. The weight of the dog tag in his pocket felt heavier with every passing minute. It was a constant reminder that Emily wasn't just a victim of random violence. There was something personal about this, something that went beyond the usual enemies. Emily's father had been involved in something dangerous, and it seemed like the people who were after them would stop at nothing to get what they wanted. Jake turned away from the window, walking over to Emily. She looked up at him as he approached, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. He didn't know how to explain it to her, how to make her understand the danger they were in. "Emily," Jake said softly, sitting down beside her. "I know you're scared. I am too." She didn't respond, but her eyes flickered toward the door. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake sighed. "We keep moving," he said. "We don't have a choice." Emily looked down at the dog tag, her fingers tracing the worn metal. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small. "Why are they after me?" Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. He didn't have all the answers, but he had to try. "Your dad was involved in something big. It's not your fault, Emily. But now, they're coming after you because of it." She looked up at him, her eyes wide with fear. "What do they want from me?" Jake shook his head. "I don't know yet. But I promise you, I'll find out. I'll stop them." Emily didn't say anything, but the look in her eyes told him everything. She wasn't convinced. Jake stood up and walked across the room, pacing again. He couldn't sit still. The weight of the situation was crushing him. He needed a plan, but he didn't know where to start. The man had mentioned getting them out of here, but Jake didn't think it would be that easy. They couldn't keep running forever. He had to find answers, and he had to find them fast. The clock was ticking, and every second they stayed in one place increased the chances of being found. He needed to go on the offensive. "I'm going to find the people behind this," Jake said, turning to Emily. "I'm going to make sure they can't hurt you anymore." She looked at him with those wide, fearful eyes. "And what if they come for us?" she asked, her voice shaking. Jake didn't know how to answer that. What if they came for them? What if they were already too close? He walked over to the door, opening it slightly to check the surroundings. The quiet outside felt almost suffocating, the kind of stillness that made you feel like danger was just waiting to pounce. "We'll be ready," Jake said, though he didn't believe it. He wasn't sure they could outrun this. The man who had helped them had been their only lead, and Jake knew that if they were going to survive, they needed more information. He had to take action. He couldn't keep Emily locked away in this place forever. He had to find out what happened to her father and why they were being hunted. But there was a part of Jake that was terrified. Not for himself, but for Emily. He couldn't protect her forever, and he didn't know how much longer he could keep up the charade that everything was going to be okay. He turned back to Emily. "We're not going to stop," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll get through this." But deep down, Jake knew the truth. The danger wasn't just outside these walls. It was coming from the past, from a world of secrets and lies that neither of them was ready to face. And no matter how much he tried to shield Emily from it, the storm was coming for them both. The rain had stopped by the time they made their way through the back door of the old warehouse, but the air still felt heavy, thick with anticipation. Jake's mind raced, his thoughts pulled in 100 different directions. The safe house they had just left felt like a distant memory now, swallowed up by the weight of the task ahead. Emily walked close beside him, her small hand gripping his tightly, as if she were trying to hold on to whatever shred of safety she could find. But Jake knew that no matter how tightly she held on to him, the storm they were in was far from over. The man who had led them to this place had already disappeared into the shadows, leaving Jake and Emily alone in a cold, dimly lit hallway. The silence was deafening, and for a brief moment, Jake wondered if it was all just a mistake. What was he really doing? He wasn't equipped for this. He was a biker, a man who had lived through a war, not a hero. He was just trying to survive. But Emily, standing quietly beside him, reminded him of why he couldn't back down. She had been through hell already, and he wasn't going to let her face it alone. He turned to her, his hand on her shoulder. "Stay close," he said softly, his voice steady, but his heart pounding. She nodded without speaking, her wide eyes fixed on him. Jake didn't know if she understood the gravity of their situation, or if she was just clinging to him out of fear. He couldn't blame her. The world they were in now was a place where survival meant more than just living. It meant fighting for every breath. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever as they moved through the dark, the only sound their footsteps echoing in the silence. Jake's senses were on high alert, every nerve in his body screaming that something wasn't right. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows creeping closer. They reached a small room at the end of the hall, the door barely hanging on its hinges. Jake pushed it open slowly, scanning the room for any sign of movement. It was empty. The room was cold, the air stale, but it was the perfect place to regroup, to figure out their next move. He pulled the door shut behind them, the sound of it locking in place almost comforting. Jake turned to Emily. "We need to figure out what's really going on here," he said. "I'm not leaving until I know the truth. Do you understand?" Emily nodded, but Jake could see the confusion in her eyes. She didn't understand everything. She couldn't, but that wasn't her fault. Jake walked over to a desk in the corner, flipping through papers that were scattered across it. There was a stack of files, all of them marked with the same symbol, the same emblem Jake had seen on the documents he found earlier. It was a symbol he hadn't thought about in years, a symbol that had haunted his past. The more he looked at it, the more he realized just how deep this rabbit hole went. Emily's father had been a part of something far bigger than either of them could imagine. Jake slammed his fist down on the desk, frustration bubbling up inside him. He had promised Emily's father that he would keep her safe, but what if the people behind this were too powerful? What if he was already too late? He ran his hands through his hair, trying to calm himself. "I won't let them win," Jake muttered under his breath. "I'll stop them, no matter what it takes." Just then, there was a sound, a sharp knock on the door. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He moved quickly, grabbing Emily's arm and pulling her behind him. "Stay down," he whispered, his voice low. The knock came again, more insistent this time. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his hand hovering near the gun he had tucked into his waistband. There was a pause, then a familiar voice answered, "It's me." Jake's heart raced as he recognized the voice. It was the man who had helped them, the one who had led them to the safe house. He moved cautiously to the door, unlocking it slowly, his hand steady as he opened it, just a crack. The man was standing there, his face grim. "You're not safe here," the man said urgently. "We need to move. Now." Jake's instincts kicked in. The situation was escalating faster than he had anticipated, and he could feel the danger closing in. He stepped aside, allowing the man to enter. Emily, still clutching the dog tag, looked up at the man, her fear obvious in her eyes. Jake could see the concern on her face. He hated seeing her like this, but he couldn't let himself be weak. "Not now. What's going on?" Jake demanded, his voice tight with urgency. The man looked around the room, his eyes scanning the corners before he spoke. They found us. They're already on their way. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He had known this day was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. He turned to Emily, his expression softening for a moment. "Stay close, Emily," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. Emily nodded, but her hands trembled as she gripped the dog tag even tighter. Jake's mind raced. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now. They were out of time. "How much time do we have?" Jake asked the man, his voice low. The man didn't answer right away, his eyes still darting around the room. "Maybe an hour. Maybe less. We need to move fast." Jake's heart was pounding now, but his voice was steady. "Let's go then. We're not staying here." He grabbed Emily's hand and led her toward the door, the weight of the dog tag still heavy in his pocket. They had no choice but to run, to keep moving. They were never going to stop until they found out what was really going on. But with every step they took, Jake knew that the truth was getting closer, and so was the danger. In this gripping tale of danger and survival, the story unfolds with intense moments of suspense, mystery, and unexpected twists. Jake, a hardened Hells Angels member, finds himself thrust into a perilous situation when he is tasked with protecting a young girl, Emily, whose father's dark past is catching up to her. As they run from unknown forces, the bond between Jake and Emily grows, as does the looming threat. With every step they take, they uncover more about the dangerous world surrounding them. This narrative, filled with high stakes and thrilling action, will pull you deeper into the world of Hells Angels stories, where betrayal, loyalty, and courage collide. As Jake fights to protect Emily, the story dives into the underworld of secrets and lies, showing just how far one man will go to keep his promise. The relentless chase leads them down dark paths, with enemies always a step behind, making each moment more intense than the last. If you are a fan of Hells Angels stories, this tale offers everything you crave: danger, heart-stopping moments, and characters you will remember long after the story ends. With the stakes higher than ever, Jake's journey to uncover the truth about Emily's father and the people after them becomes a battle for survival. The world of Hells Angels stories is brought to life with vivid descriptions of the struggle to escape, fight, and protect the innocent. As secrets are revealed and alliances are tested, Jake and Emily must face the reality that their lives are in constant danger. This story of Hells Angels stories not only delivers thrilling action, but also explores themes of redemption, family, and the strength to survive against all odds.